You need to understand your silence is not a trick. It is not a tactic. It is not some clever move to make someone miss you. It is the moment you finally stop bleeding in a conversation where you are the only one speaking. For so long you were taught that love means you explain, you soften, you hold space, you give chances, you try again and again and again. You believe that if you could just say the right words in the right tone with the right patience, they would finally feel safe enough to meet you. But an avoidant often doesn't respond to more words. They respond to less access. They respond when the old pattern stops working, when the withdrawal no longer earns them control, when distance no longer comes with the comfort of knowing you'll still be there keeping the connection alive. You need to understand an avoidant is not always sitting there thinking, how can I hurt you? Most of the time they are thinking, how can I not feel overwhelmed? Closeness can feel like pressure to them. Intimacy can feel like expectation, and expectation can feel like a trap. So when emotions rise, when you ask for clarity, when you want consistency, their nervous system does what it learned to do a long time ago. It pulls away, they go quiet, they get cold, they disappear, not because you are unworthy, but because closeness activates fear. And for a while you tried to love that fear out of them. You tried to be softer, easier, more understanding, less demanding, less emotional, more chill, because you thought if you became less of a need, they would become more of a partner. But what happened instead is that your kindness became predictable, your forgiveness became guaranteed, and your availability became the safety net that made their disappearing act feel consequence-free. And this is where your silence becomes powerful because it changes the whole system. Before, when they pulled away, you reached out. When they went quiet, you filled the space. When they gave you mixed signals, you tried to decode them. You were doing emotional labor on behalf of both of you. You were keeping the relationship alive while they stayed comfortable in the gray area. And you need to understand the gray area is where an avoidant can breathe. It's where they can be close without being accountable, connected without being consistent, wanted without having to fully show up. So when you finally stop chasing, your silence removes the gray area. Your silence is the clean boundary that says, I'm not available for confusion anymore. It isn't loud, but it is firm. It doesn't beg, but it is final. It doesn't attack, but it refuses to continue the same cycle. You need to understand why that terrifies them, because boundaries take away control. And control has often been their version of safety. When they could step back and still feel you holding on, they didn't have to face the cost of their distance. They could disappear and return without repair. They could offer crumbs and still keep your devotion. They could keep you emotionally attached without ever risking full vulnerability. But your silence does something they are not prepared for. It introduces consequences without drama. It shows them that you can love and still leave, that you can care and still choose peace, that you can feel deeply and still refuse to chase. That's why your silence becomes their nightmare. Because it's not the silence of a person waiting, it's the silence of a person detaching. And detachment is the one thing their pattern cannot control. And here's the part that matters. Your silence is not coldness, it is self-respect with a steady heartbeat. Self-respect doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up in what you no longer tolerate. It shows up in what you stop explaining. It shows up in the way you don't send the 10th message after the 9th went unanswered. It shows up when you stop asking for closure from someone who keeps choosing disappearance. It shows up when you realize that someone's inability to meet you does not mean you should keep lowering yourself to fit. You need to understand sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop offering your heart to someone who keeps treating it like something they can pick up whenever they feel like it. And yes, it will hurt because silence requires strength. Silence means you sit with the urge to reach out and you don't. Silence means you feel the ache in your chest and you breathe through it. Silence means you don't soothe your anxiety with contact. You soothe it with truth. And the truth is, if someone only shows up when you are leaving, they are not in love with you. They are in love with access. If someone only offers effort when they feel you slipping away, they are not committed to connection. They are committed to control. And you need to understand you were never meant to be someone's option, someone's backup, someone's comfort when they feel lonely. You were meant to be chosen with clarity, with consistency, with care. Your silence is also a mirror. It forces them to face what they avoided, the reality of what they created. Because when you stop chasing, they lose the proof that you're still there. They lose the emotional reassurance that kept them comfortable. They lose the ability to step back and still feel powerful. And then something begins to happen. They start to feel what they postponed. They may not call it regret, but it shows up as confusion, as restlessness, as checking your social media, as sending a casual hey, as testing the door without admitting they slammed it. And in that moment, you need to understand the goal is not to make them suffer. The goal is to protect your peace. Your silence is not revenge, it is recovery. So hold the line, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with dignity. Let your silence be clean. Let it be the kind of silence that doesn't beg, doesn't punish, doesn't hint. It simply ends the pattern. And if they call it ruthless, let them. People call boundaries ruthless when they were benefiting from your lack of them. You need to understand you are not being harsh. You are being honest. You are not being dramatic. You are being done. You are not playing a game. You are stepping out of one. And when you stay in that truth, your silence stops being a void. It becomes a doorway back to yourself, back to your power, back to the kind of love that does not require you to abandon your dignity to receive it. You need to understand an avoidant may act like closeness doesn't matter, but what they fear most is not love itself. It's what love demands of them. Love demands presence. Love demands consistency. Love demands that you stay in the room when emotions rise, that you don't disappear when things get real, that you don't hide behind space when someone is asking for clarity. And an avoidant has often learned long before you came along that closeness can cost them something. Their freedom, their control, their safety, their identity. So they pull back, not always because they don't care, but because care starts to feel like risk. They may not even have the words for that fear. They may call it being busy. They may call it needing time. They may call it not wanting drama. But underneath it is a nervous system that learned to survive by creating distance. And you need to understand something else. Avoidance can tolerate closeness when it's on their terms, when they can step in and step out, when they can choose intimacy in moments and retreat when it gets intense. That's why things can feel so confusing with them. One day they're affectionate, present, almost soft in a way that makes you believe this is it. They're finally letting me in. And then as soon as the relationship asks for something real, a conversation, a plan, an emotional truth, a deeper commitment, they pull away. They don't always do it with cruelty. Sometimes they do it with silence. And silence is the most painful form of distance because it leaves you holding questions with no answers. It leaves you carrying the emotional weight alone. It leaves you trying to decode what you did wrong when the truth is you didn't cause their fear. You just got close enough to trigger it. You need to understand why your silence changes the game. Because for a long time, their distance had a predictable result. You would reach for them. Their absence would activate your devotion. Their quiet would activate your explaining. Their coldness would activate your softness. And even if they didn't say it out loud, that made them feel safe because it meant they could retreat and still keep access to you. It meant they could avoid the discomfort of emotional accountability and still not lose the connection. That is why your silence becomes their nightmare, because it removes the safety of that old system. It introduces consequences without anger, without threats, without drama. It says if you disappear, you don't get to return, like nothing happened. And for someone who has survived by keeping the door half open, that feels terrifying because now the door is closing and they didn't get to control it. And here is what you need to understand. Consequences are not punishment. Consequences are reality. A boundary is not an attack. A boundary is a truth you finally decide to honor. When you stop chasing, you are not being cold. You are being clear. When you stop explaining, you are not being harsh. You are protecting your dignity. When you stop doing the emotional labor for two people, you are not giving up on love. You are giving up on a pattern that was slowly draining your self-worth. Because love without consistency is a slow heartbreak. It's waking up to uncertainty. It's checking your phone like it controls your mood. It's replaying conversations wondering if you were too much, too sensitive, too needy when all you were really asking for was basic human effort. You need to understand how an avoidant experiences your silence internally. At first, they feel relief. That's real. When you stop reaching, the pressure drops and their nervous system calms. But then something else begins, something they didn't expect. They start to feel the emptiness of the space they created. They start to notice your absence, not as a threat, but as a loss. And the reason it becomes a nightmare is because they can't soothe it the way they used to. Before they could pull away and still feel you there, still feel you holding on. Now they pull away and the silence stays silent. No messages, no reassurance, no emotional safety net, just the echo of their own choices. And in that silence, their mind begins to ask questions they worked hard not to ask. Did I push away someone genuine? Did I take their love for granted? What if they're really gone? What if I can't get that back? This is where they often test the door. a casual, hey, a like on your story, a small reach that pretends nothing happened. Not because they are suddenly healed, but because they want to see if your boundary is real. They want to see if you're still the person who will open the door the moment they knock. And you need to understand this is the moment that decides your future, because attention after neglect feels intoxicating. A tiny message can feel like a miracle when you've been starving. But you have to ask yourself, are they coming with accountability, or are they coming for access? Are they offering consistency, or are they offering crumbs to reattach you? Because if you let them back in without a new standard, you teach them the old rule again. I can disappear and you will still be there. So let your silence remain a boundary, not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself enough to stop abandoning your peace. Let your silence be clean, not emotional punishment, but emotional protection. Let it be the quiet that says, I'm not available for confusion. I'm available for clarity. Let it be the quiet that says, I'm not here to be an option. I'm here to be chosen. You need to understand the nightmare is not your silence. The nightmare is the reality. Your silence reveals that you are not asking for too much. You are asking the wrong person. And that from this moment forward, your life belongs to your standards, your dignity, your healing, and the kind of love that doesn't require you to chase it to keep it alive. You need to understand when you stop chasing, you don't just become quiet. You remove the emotional mirror they were using to feel safe without ever having to fully show up. And that is why your silence becomes louder than any argument you ever had. Because for so long, your reactions were the proof that the connection still existed. Your paragraphs were the proof that you still cared. Your questions were the proof that you were still attached. Your forgiveness was the proof that they could disappear and return without facing what they did. Even your tears were proof that they still mattered, proof that they still had access to your heart. And when you finally stopped giving them that mirror, when you finally stopped reflecting their importance back to them, the room went quiet in a way they were not prepared for. You need to understand an avoidant often learns to regulate themselves through distance, but they also regulate themselves through control. Not always conscious control, not always manipulative, but control in the sense of I decide when we get close. I decide when we pull back. That's why they can seem confident when they're withdrawing. That's why they can look calm when you're falling apart, because in that moment they feel like they're steering the ship. They feel safe because they are the one reducing the emotional temperature. And you, being the one who cared, kept trying to bring warmth back. You kept trying to restore the connection. You kept trying to make the relationship feel secure. But the truth is, every time you chased, you gave them the steering wheel again. You rewarded distance with attention. You rewarded silence with effort. You rewarded inconsistency with reassurance. You didn't do it because you were foolish. You did it because you were hopeful. You did it because you believed love could be proven. And you tried to prove it until it almost cost you your peace. But you need to understand the moment you stop chasing is the moment you stop feeding their comfort. It's the moment they can no longer disappear and still feel powerful. Because your silence is not just a lack of messages. It is a lack of emotional supply. It is the absence of the one thing that kept them regulated without them realizing it. Your attention. Your attention was the proof they could retreat and still be wanted. Your attention was the proof they could stay half in and still be valued. Your attention was the proof they could avoid vulnerability and still keep the benefits of intimacy. And when that disappears, something inside them starts to shake because now they have to sit with themselves. And avoidants often struggle most when they are forced to sit with the emotional truth they've been running from. You need to understand your silence creates a new kind of discomfort for them. Not the discomfort of being yelled at, not the discomfort of being blamed, but the discomfort of not being able to predict you. Before they knew the script, they pull away. You reach, they go quiet. You speak, they give crumbs. You try to turn it into something meaningful, but when you stop, the script breaks. And when scripts break, people who lived comfortably inside them suddenly feel exposed. They start replaying moments. They start wondering what you're doing. They start imagining you moving on. And that imagination becomes the nightmare because it forces them to face the one thing they never wanted to face. That you were not guaranteed, that your love was not a permanent resource, that your patience had an end, that your heart could close the door and not open it again. And listen, you need to understand the nightmare isn't that you're silent. The nightmare is that your silence sounds like peace. It sounds like you're not drowning anymore. It sounds like you stopped fighting. It sounds like you finally accepted the truth. Because anger still feels like attachment to an avoidant. Tears still feel like attachment. Questions still feel like attachment. Even accusations still feel like attachment. but calm silence. The kind that doesn't beg and doesn't break. The kind that doesn't try to win and doesn't try to punish. That kind of silence tells them something terrifying. You're not emotionally hooked anymore. You are not trying to pull them back. You are not waiting for their readiness. You are finally living your life as if you are the main character again, not a supporting role in their emotional avoidance. That is why when your silence becomes real, they often come back in the smallest ways. Not with a big confession, not with the full honesty you deserved, but with testing, a casual message, a "hey stranger," a story like a late night thinking of you. These are not always love letters. They are often temperature checks. They are ways to see if the old mirror is still there, if you will still reflect them, if you will still respond, if you will still soften. And you need to understand this is where your healing gets tested, because part of you will want to respond. Part of you will want to believe that this means they finally care. Part of you will want to rush back into the comfort of connection, because withdrawal hurts even when leaving is right. But you have to ask yourself a harder question. Are they coming back with accountability, or are they coming back for access? Because access is what kept them comfortable. Access without responsibility, access without consistency, access without courage. And your silence is the first time they are forced to experience you as unavailable to that pattern. That's why it becomes a nightmare. Not because you are cruel, but because you are no longer convenient. Not because you are cold, but because you are clear. Not because you stopped loving, but because you stopped letting love make you smaller. So stay steady. Let your silence remain clean. Let it be the quiet that protects you from the cycle. Let it be the boundary that keeps you from reopening a wound just to feel close to the person who caused it. You need to understand your silence is not emptiness. It is power. It is self-respect in action. It is you refusing to be the emotional mirror for someone who won't meet you with consistency. And the moment you stop reflecting them, you start seeing yourself again. And that is the real beginning, not of their regret, but of your freedom. You need to understand the nightmare is not that you became quiet. The nightmare is that you started healing. And healing makes you unavailable to the same old cycle. Because when you were still emotionally reachable, even in pain, you were still part of the pattern. You were still responding, still explaining, still trying to make it make sense, still offering them warmth while they offered you distance. And even though it hurt you, your emotional availability kept the connection alive. It kept the door cracked open. It gave them a way to come and go without ever facing the full cost of leaving. But when you begin to heal, something changes that they can feel. Even if you never say a word, your energy becomes solid, your silence becomes clean, your absence becomes peaceful. And that peace is frightening to someone who relied on your anxiety to feel important. You need to understand an avoidant is often most comfortable when you are emotionally activated. Not because they enjoy your pain, but because your activation proves you're still attached. Your questions prove you still care. Your paragraphs prove you're still invested. Your tears prove they still matter. Even your anger proves they still have a place in your heart. But your peace says something else. Your peace says, I can live without you. Your peace says, I can breathe without your attention. Your peace says, I am not going to chase you into silence anymore. And that is the moment the ground shifts under them. Because if you can be okay without them, they can no longer control distance the way they used to. They can no longer step back and feel safe that you'll be right there holding the rope. You need to understand when you heal, you stop rewarding inconsistency. You stop turning crumbs into meals. You stop translating their silence into hope. You stop making excuses for behavior that keeps hurting you. Healing doesn't just change your emotions. It changes your standards. It changes what you tolerate. It changes what you entertain. It changes what you call love. And that is exactly why the avoidant starts to feel restless, because the version of you that made it easy for them is disappearing. The version of you that would accept confusion, that would accept an apology without change, that version is fading. And when that version fades, they start to feel the loss more intensely because they weren't just losing a person, they were losing access to the comfort your overgiving gave them. And here's what you need to understand. Healing is not loud. Healing doesn't post a speech. Healing doesn't announce itself. Healing is quiet discipline. It's waking up and missing them and still not texting. It's reaching for your phone and putting it down again. It's accepting that you won't get the closure you wanted and still choosing not to reopen the wound. It's letting yourself feel the ache without using contact as a painkiller. It's telling the truth to yourself, this connection costs me too much. And the avoidant feels that shift because suddenly your silence doesn't sound like sadness anymore. It sounds like acceptance. It sounds like you're not waiting. It sounds like you're not bargaining. It sounds like you're moving on. You need to understand why this becomes their nightmare. Because avoidants often postpone grief. They feel relief first. They feel calm when distance happens. They tell themselves it's fine. They distract themselves. They push feelings down. But when you heal, when you stop chasing, when you stop giving them emotional access, their delayed emotions rise, not always as love at first, sometimes as anxiety, as irritation, as curiosity, as a strange emptiness they can't name. They start checking your social media. They start replaying memories. They start wondering who is getting the version of you they took for granted. And what haunts them is not a dramatic scene. It's the image of you living without them, smiling without them, being okay without them, because that image tells them something they never wanted to face, that their distance didn't make you chase forever. It made you leave. And in that moment, they may reach out, not always in a big honest way, but in a small careful way. A casual message, a hey, a late night check-in, a reaction to your story, these are often tests. And you need to understand tests are not the same thing as repair. Testing is about access. Repair is about accountability. Testing says, are you still there? Repair says, I understand what I did, and I want to change. Testing tries to pull you back into the old rhythm without ever naming the harm. Repair builds a new rhythm with honesty. And if you are healing, you will feel the difference. You will feel how your body reacts. You will feel that old rush, that old hope, that old craving for connection. But healing is choosing your future over your craving. Healing is not replying from hunger. Healing is responding, if you respond at all, from standards. You need to understand your healing is not a punishment to them. It is a promise to you. It is you finally choosing a life where love is steady, where connection is mutual, where you don't have to earn basic care by being endlessly patient. It is you refusing to be the person who keeps the door open for someone who only knocks when they feel lonely. It is you refusing to be the emotional home for someone who won't live in that home with you. And yes, that will feel like a nightmare to them because they are losing the easy version of you, the version that made it possible to stay avoidant and still keep love nearby. So let your silence stay peaceful. Let your boundaries stay firm. Let your healing keep moving forward, because the goal was never to make them suffer. The goal is to make you whole. You need to understand your silence became their nightmare because it stopped being silence filled with longing and started being silence filled with self-respect. And once you taste that kind of peace, you will never again confuse chaos with chemistry. You will never again confuse inconsistency with depth, and you will never again offer your heart to someone who treats your love like something they can pick up and put down whenever they feel like.